Hey guys, so I know we have been continuing our discussion on arrow functions, and as you know, the arrow functions are really important. So, in this lecture, also, we'll continue our discussion around arrow functions. Now, there are three things that I'd like to talk to you about in this lecture, and the first thing is, of course, how arrow functions behave with arrays and how you can use them. Then, the second thing we'll talk about is how to bind the arguments or probably use the arguments in arrow functions. I know the arrow functions do not have their own arguments, but I'll show you how, if they are used with the non-arrow functions, they can use the arguments of the non-arrow functions. And the third thing is how to identify an arrow function, or probably is it a function or not a function. We'll also check those three things in the coming lecture. So let's hit the road and let's quickly see. So the first thing is the concise syntax of writing an arrow function makes them ideal for use and array processing too. Now, for example, if you want to sort an array, like if you see out here, what I've done is just got an array of values, sort the values, and I've given it a comparator. Now, the comparator is just a function which just takes a and b and returns a minus b and tries to get the value. Now, that's a lot of code. Now, if you want to reduce it and try to write the comparator using the arrow function, it gets very easy. So instead of this entire function, all you need to do is have ab as an input, have the arrow function, and just do a minus b as a return. You don't even need the bracket, you don't need the curly brackets. A minus b, and that's it. That's all the code that you need to write. Now let me show you actually let me just copy this and do a control Z, so I can show you that the answer still remains the same even with the console log. So console.log, and let me say result. So you should be able to see the result out there. It's 1, 2, 10, 15, 20. It's all sorted out. Now, if I just remove everything and replace it with what I just wrote, which was using the arrow function, the answer still remains the same. No change. So the implementation has gotten much better, much easier, and much faster. Now, the array methods that accept callback functions just like sort, map, or probably reduce will benefit tremendously with the simpler syntax of arrow functions, because now they simplify a lot of code. You don't have to write a lot of code. Now you can see the whole 2 or 3 lines became just like 6 letters pretty much, and that's all the arrow function did. So if you have to use arrow functions in your whatever functions that accept array method as a callback, you can definitely go for arrow functions. Now the next thing that we will try to see is arguments. Now, even though arrow functions don't have their own arguments object, it's possible for them to access the arguments object from a containing function. Yes, the arguments object is available no matter where the arrow function is executed later on. So let me show you an example. You have a function out here, which is my function. It just does a console log of arguments of 0. Let me just quickly call that function so that we can see it on the console. So my function, and let me pass the parameter as abhay. So that should give me abhay on the screen, as you can see. Now that is very easy. I have the arguments, but what if I want to use arrow function and try to return the value? So let me quickly just comment this out. I don't need this. Now let's try to do a return in the function, and the return should be an arrow function. Now this arrow function can return the arguments of 0. Now once I do that, I can just store this into a value. Let's say my value is equal to that function call, and once I have that function call, I can just do a console.log of my value, and I should start getting abhay on the screen once again. Oh well, it did not work because I have a typo out here. It should be value and not value, ye. So I fixed that, and it gives me arguments of 0. Now this will return a function, so this has to be a function call, and that should give me abhay. Now that is the only change that you have to make for using arrow function with the argument. So whatever you pass the arguments to my function can now be used by this arrow function as a return. Now let me elaborate this whole procedure that happened out here. So my function, you initially saw that my function had the argument 0, which we just did a console log, and we got abhay as the output, which was the first element. Now what happens is when the arrow function is later executed, which is using the arguments that was there to the original function, even though the arrow function is no longer in the scope of the function that created it, which is out here because arrow function is inside it, now that created it, which is out here. So my value is nothing but the arrow function that will be returned to it. Now arguments is definitely outside, which means arguments should not be available to it. But because the arrow function is residing in the my function, and due to the change scope of how the functions can access their parent non-arrow function contents, this function can easily have access to the arguments even when it is not in the context, which means you have arrow function separated in the my value. Now if you make a function call to this, it will still have access to the argument 0 that was passed to my function. I hope that clarifies it a little. The next thing is, how do you identify if the function is an arrow function? Well, despite the different syntax, the functions are still functions and are identified such. So that you can just do a console.log and you can just do a type of, and you can say let me use comparator, which was well, I don't have a comparator yet, so let me just quickly write a comparator. So variable comparator is equals to a comma b, that's what we did in the sort function, arrow function, and then it returns an a minus b. That's all. Now here I can just do my type of the comparator function that I have, comparator, and it should give me as function. You can see now if I try to compare this to a instance of function, even that should work. So comparator, if it is an instance of function, which is the function object, it should still give me a true value. You can see out here it gives me the true value. So it is at the end of the day a function itself. So I hope this clarifies three things that we talked about. First is how you can use the arrow functions with the array, especially when there are array methods in the callbacks. And two, when the arguments are there, so you can see how we use the arguments of the non-arrow function parent. And three is how to identify if the function is a function or probably an arrow function, because it's the same as the function call. So that was all about arrow functions. I'll see you in the next class.